much to Dr. Anderson for inviting us along. Liz and I are going to do a sort of double act.
It's going to be interesting.
Yes, we'll sort of shuttle backwards and forwards. It's lovely to be here. We speak to a lot of veterinary audiences, and veterinary audiences have a very distinct, often quite unpleasant smell. So it's nice to address an audience that smells vaguely of antiseptic hand wash. What we thought we'd do is talk a little bit about the veterinary profession in the UK, and apologies to those of you who are familiar with the profession in the UK, and then talk a little bit about what we went through in the development of the school at Sutton Bonington, and then just highlight a few areas in which we think the school in the Nottingham Vet School is slightly different from the other vet schools in the UK. And then obviously if there are any questions at the end, we'll be happy to take those. I'm going to wander around if that's okay, because I can't see up there. This is the first cohort of students. This is a very brave lot of students because they came into the school in September 2006, and some of them had offers. It's not like they didn't have anywhere else to go. Some of them actually had offers from other vet schools and chose to come here, even though the school had no Royal College accreditation and no actual guarantee that we would be recognised by the Royal College ultimately. So they were a very brave cohort of students, and I have a nasty feeling they're going to be quite difficult to shake off because they've invested a great deal in the school. The Royal College of Veterinary Surgeons is our regulatory body. It's very much like the General Medical Council, and they are responsible for making sure that vets in practice well and ethically, but they're also responsible for the quality of veterinary education in the UK. And it is them that we had to satisfy as far as the quality of the course was concerned. If we look at figures from 2010, there are about 24,000 registered veterinary surgeons registered with the UK. I think the veterinary profession is about a tenth of the size of the medical profession. I'm not sure. I think it's roughly that sort of order of size. So it's quite a small profession compared to medicine. Even smaller when you consider that there are only about 18,000 of those registered vets are working. Many of them are retired, but stay on the register in order to be able to carry out little odds and ends of bits of work. But of those 18,000, 85% of them will be in general veterinary practice. And general veterinary practice in the UK is a private business. They are all in private practice. They are all running small or medium-sized businesses. So they suffer if the economic climate deteriorates. What it does mean is that there's no NHS for any of our patients. That has its downside, but it also means that the government doesn't interfere with our profession on a particularly regular basis. So most of our graduates will go into general veterinary practice, and there are roughly 5,000 practices in the UK. And this is quite an interesting figure because around about 1,200 new vets are registered each year, and that's been constant for about the last 10 years. Roughly the same number of vets pack up veterinary practice each year. So the size of the profession hasn't changed very much over the last 10 years. We register about 1,200 new vets each year, but interestingly, 500 in 2010 of those 1,200 new registrants, 500 came from overseas schools. We only produce roughly half of the number of vets in this country that we need. And that's one of the reasons that Nottingham was allowed to open another veterinary school. If we look at the gender balance, it's very, very similar to what's happening in medicine. Roughly 70% of each intake each year within the veterinary schools is female. You can see the gender balance is changing quite considerably over time. So 85% of those graduates are going to go into practice, and these days most people will go into either farm animal practice, companion animal practice, or equine practice. The days of James Herriot are pretty much over. There are very few people who are in mixed veterinary practice doing a little bit of everything. Most of our students will graduate and go into either farm, companion animal, or equine practice. Practices vary enormously in size. There are some multi-vet practices. One of the practices we work with has 36 vets. A lot of vets work on their own. So the size of different practices is hugely variable. Most people work out of practice premises, but there are still vets who work out of a car boot and do not have any fixed premises. Most vets will be generalists, but increasingly vets are tending to specialise not only in different species, but also specialisms within those species. So there are many vets now who are small animal orthopaedic surgeons or small animal soft tissue surgeons or small animal internal medicine specialists. And that's becoming increasingly common. And there's a huge range of opportunities in terms of working full-time or part-time. What has happened in the last 5 years is there's been a significant increase in corporate veterinary groups. Rather like what happened in ophthalmology, where a lot of the ophthalmologists disappeared and people like Specsavers appeared, that is happening within the veterinary profession. Practices are selling their practices to corporate groups who look after all the back office functions, all the employment functions, all the ordering, and that allows the vets just to do the vetting. There are advantages and disadvantages to the rise of corporate veterinary groups, but there are 3 or 4 who are now very, very sizable in the UK. And you will start to see veterinary brands, a bit like Specsavers has become a very well-recognised brand. You will, I'm sure, in the next 10 years see veterinary brands which appear very much in the way that Specsavers and organisations like that have appeared. This is Dr. Elizabeth Mossop, a new graduate. As you can see, her idea of health and safety was not well developed when she first went into practice. I think she's rather rectaling a horse in the open is reckless, but right next to your new practice car is even more reckless.
Plain stupidity.
Pardon?
Plain stupidity, I think.
So there you are.
I was very young.
That's Liz when she was very young. And there is a lot to learn. That one of the things we don't teach the students is how to drive. We did have a great idea, actually. We thought we should be teaching the students to change a wheel on a car, because when we polled the students, many of them had never changed a wheel on a car, and most of them, if they go into rural practice, will be driving a lot of the time. So we thought, what a great practical, we'll teach them to change a wheel. Unfortunately, somebody told the safety office in the university, and that's now stopped. We're not allowed to do that anymore, because you're never going to do that in real life, are you? So it must be dangerous. But this is my car. I went into practice in East Anglia, rural East Anglia, and I, for some reason, it must have been very icy, ended up with my car in this ditch. And I'd wandered down the road to get there's a local farm just down here, and I'd wandered down the road to get him to pull me out with his tractor. And I didn't realise that 2 of my colleagues came down that road after me. What are the chances of that? So this is my boss's car, and this is the other assistant, Pete's car. And unfortunately, my boss had a camera. And while I was talking to the farmer, they saw this car in the ditch, took a photograph of it, and drove off. And when I got back to the practice, there were lots of questions like, how was your day? Oh, fine, no problem. No problems at all. No problems at all. How's the car? Perfect. No problems. No problems with the car at all. None at all. And then they produced this photograph about 2 weeks later. But we don't teach the students to drive, but perhaps it is something that we should be doing, given the amount of time they will spend in cars. So Liz, you're going to talk a little bit about species and specialisation, and maybe some of the differences between veterinary practice and medical practice.
Yes, I thought it would be interesting, hopefully that sort of set the scene for you a little bit about the veterinary profession, but I thought it would be interesting to focus on a few areas that I feel is slightly different to medical training, but also some issues that maybe never thought about to do with our profession. So the first thing is really around specialisation and this vast range of species that we as vets are expected to be able to treat. So you can see up in the top right there, this is one of my friends from vet school, Sarah. She is the head vet at Paynton Zoo. Here she is intubating a tiger. Okay, so there really is a vast range of species that we do end up looking after. This is me as a student. I went and worked out in Egypt for 3 months and perfected my camel medicine techniques. I can't say they've come in particularly handy through my career, but it was certainly an interesting opportunity. So there's lots of different species, and really the question is, to what level do we train the students in all these different species? And traditionally, veterinary courses are very much geared towards teaching students about cats and dogs, horses, cows and pigs, and that's kind of your base level. But of course nowadays actually they're more likely to sort of see rabbits and things like that, as well as the vast range of exotic species that people keep and zoos look after. So the question for us as we train them is, to what level do we go into detail about all the different animals that they need to look at? There's also a huge amount of breed differences. So what you may not realise is that, just as like in our population, the diseases that a Great Dane gets are actually very different to diseases that a little dog like a Shih Tzu or a Chihuahua would get. So, different breeds are affected by different conditions. So that's something else that, we have to teach the students to remember. Well, if you see a Great Dane, it's much more likely to have a bone tumour than a little small dog. So there's lots of things like that we need to remember about. Luckily, anatomy, yes, it's very different, but also there's a lot of similarities. So this is a nice comparative anatomy picture that I always like to show the students out of their first year anatomy textbook, showing you that actually horses and cows once did have 5 metatarsi, so therefore they are still there. They're just very tiny and vestigial and don't do very much anymore. So there are similarities, there are differences, and that's something that we have to think about quite carefully as we train the students. And then when they graduate and they go out into practice, as Malcolm's already mentioned, there are opportunities to specialise. They will graduate as what we call omnicompetent, so they will have a good understanding of all the species. There is no specialisation during their training, although they will have a small amount of elective work in the final year. So once they come out, they might decide they want to specialise in a particular species. So they could, for example, become an exotics vet and work in zoos, or they might decide they want to specialise in a particular discipline. So a lot of the disciplines will actually cover, so Malcolm is a cardiologist, but he treats everything from horses to dogs and cats, but only hearts. So it works in a couple of different ways. Our system is quite different to the medical system in that it's actually really pretty poorly structured, and I'll talk about a bit more about that in a minute. But we don't have a college system as such. We have one Royal College, the Royal College, that looks after us all. And once you specialise, you don't join different colleges. It's only the Royal College that awards certificates and diplomas and things. So that's a little bit different, does cause some issues and some conflicts within the profession. They've recently decided that they would like all vets to have postgraduate qualifications. It makes sense. Many of you that go to your local practice with your dog or your cat, your vet probably won't have a postgraduate qualification. Most vets don't. But they realise that this is perhaps not the best thing in the world. So they have now created some new modular certificates, which is a postgraduate qualification, which is hopefully a lot simpler to get, so that people do carry on gaining qualifications, which is obviously quite an important thing for the profession as a whole, as well as for individuals who want to get on and succeed. So that's just a little bit about specialisation and the challenges of all the different animals that we have to look after. Another concept that you may not be aware of, you may be aware of if you come from an agricultural background, is around sort of approaches to herds of animals. So obviously, as well as treating individual animals, as a vet, you have to be able to treat whole herds and manage whole herds. So this is very much what's happened in the dairy industry. It would be quite unusual now to be called out to see an individual sick cow. Whereas, of course, if you go back to James Herriot, as Malcolm's already mentioned, as a mixed practitioner, you'd be doing your rounds and you'd go and see a cow here and a sheep and a pig and a horse and all that kind of thing. Nowadays, really, with particularly dairy farming, it's an extremely specialised industry. And most of our graduates who go in and do dairy work will be working in sort of specialised practices, and they will very much be treating and running preventative medicine and sort of production type schemes for whole herds of cattle. And this is a lot to do with the way that dairy farming has changed in the UK. Of course, some years ago there were a lot more cows, and the cows had a lot lower milk yield. Nowadays our cows are extremely high producing, so these are bovine athletes producing sort of 7,500 litres of milk per year, and there's a lot less of them, and there's a lot less herds as well. So not less people that actually run dairy herds if you look at the number of farmers. So it is a very specialised industry, and our students in the final years spend a couple of weeks on our herd health rotation, where they go on sort of farm visits. So you can see some students here on a farm visit. They talk to the farmers, they work out what's going on production-wise, they suggest tweaks and changes in nutrition and in management and all those kind of things. And this is, as I say, an area that's really happened probably exponentially over the last 10 years or so, which is an interesting concept that we've had to include in our curriculum. And most of this course is now run on sort of complicated computer programs and that kind of thing as well. So it's an important aspect that we do have to think about as vets. The other thing which I feel is probably wrongly quite different to the medical profession is what our graduates are expected to do day one out in practice. I use this phrase as the oven-ready graduate. They really are expected on day one to get out there and get stuck in. It's sort of something in our profession almost that, you know, we just are. We expect our new graduates to be able to have a reasonable level in practical as well as their knowledge areas. So, you know, they do need to actually be able to come out and do operations and you know, put lots of catheters in and everything like that. They are expected to be able to do that. There's not going to be anybody training them. Hopefully when they are out in practice to begin with, they will of course have support from colleagues, but that's sort of a, you know, a very informal system. Until recently there's been nothing formal at all, which is, you know, quite a surprise for many people. So, as I say, the profession does expect this fairly high level of competency, and also, you know, they're expected to do everything. So, from, you know, performing a post-mortem, our students have to have, you know, quite a lot of training so that they can do this kind of thing, right through to, this is Malcolm doing a splenectomy on a dog. Quite a few years ago, is it fair to say, Malcolm?
Fair, a little while ago, yeah.
we don't allow him to do surgery anymore. But this is what, a year in practice?
First year in practice.
Yeah. So, you know, performing what is, you know, quite a major operation. The typical operation that the students all get hung up about is bitch spaying, so ovarian hysterectomies, and you know, there is always this thing about how many bitch spays have you done before you graduate and all this kind of thing. So, you know, they are expected to really have quite a high level of surgical competency and be very, very omnicompetent in all the species. The postgraduate structure, as I've already mentioned, is quite poor. So a lot of them, well, we hope that most of ours will go on and do some kind of postgraduate qualification, but a lot of vets don't. And the other issue is around the Royal College. So until recently, there was no postgraduate support at all. There is now a 2-year period, the professional development phase, where they are expected to create, to complete an online portfolio and record what they're up to. However, the Royal College has no sort of enforcement ability from that point of view, because the Veterinary Surgeons Act hasn't changed since the 1960s. So although they can strongly recommend the graduates take part in this programme, they don't actually have to do it. So it's a bit of a dilemma, really, and obviously we hope all our graduates do join up to this kind of thing and carry on and do it. And then, of course, we could open up the whole can of worms around revalidation and CPD. Again, CPD for us is mandatory, but in actual fact, if you don't do any, there's nobody checking up on you. So, you know, if you got into trouble, they would tell you off about it, but it's not enforceable under the current Veterinary Surgeons Act. So there are moves to reinvent the Veterinary Surgeons Act. They tried to do it a few years ago, but unfortunately Parliament feels there's more important things to be discussing than the Veterinary Surgeons Act. So there are some issues there for our profession to cope with. This is the other element which you may not be aware that veterinary surgeons have training in, but all vets have to be trained to quite a high level in public health, and there's this concept of farm to fork. So we're not just talking about meat inspection, which obviously is something that vets do get involved in, but we're also talking about the health of our livestock on the farms in order to ensure that you get a healthy carcass at the end of the day. So obviously there's TB testing and those sorts of elements and things like that always in the news, but also there's other areas that we need to train the students in. And of course, big concept at the moment is all about animals, humans, One Health, and sort of the crossover between our two professions, which is another sort of relatively, not a recent concept, but it's had more press, if you like, recently. Our students get a lot of pathology training, so they spend a lot of time cutting up dead things, which is quite an important aspect of what they do. This is Malcolm's joke. It's quite good. But we're just thinking about the fact that, you know, animals and humans have a lot to do with each other, and that becomes particularly important when we come to things like bird flu.
Okay, so I think the breadth of the training that veterinary undergraduates undergo suits them very well if they do choose to go into research or industry. There's quite a lot of vets in pharmaceutical, within the pharmaceutical industry, and quite a lot in research institutes as well. So that's another career option. Interestingly, the Royal Army Veterinary Corps is the only corps in the Army which is currently getting bigger. Because of the Army's activities in Afghanistan and Iraq, they're using an awful lot more dogs, and the other thing is that they've had to relearn is the use of pack ponies. Because of the terrain in Iraq and Afghanistan, they can't land helicopters. And all of a sudden they realized that they had to go back to using ponies to transport stuff up into mountains. The British Army, of course, brought all the leather and wooden equipment out of storage, whereas the American Army have lightweight carbon fiber and plastic equipment. But our ponies in the British Army have gone back to the 1940s leather and wooden equipment that they carry, so they're probably a lot fitter. But it means that they've had to train an awful lot more handlers. And we have a relationship with the Defence Animal Centre at Melton Mowbray where they train a lot of the dogs and the dog handlers. It's a very interesting place to go. Whenever I come out, I always want to walk like this. And it's very disconcerting because everyone salutes you because you're always with an officer. So you sort of stand there doing this sort of thing all day. But they've got a lot of these dogs who will respond only to one handler. And they'll often take these dogs that are unhandleable by anyone else, and they'll retrain them. And these guys will have complete control over these dogs. But if you go there, they give you a briefing when you arrive, and they say, if one of the dogs escapes, stand still. Whatever you do, do not run. If you stand still, it is slightly less likely to bite you. Okay, so we spent, there's about 200 or 300 horses and 200 or 300 dogs at Melton Mowbray. We utilise the facilities there for teaching undergraduates. But interestingly, we've now got 2 students who are on Army bursaries because they're trying to recruit more and more vets. It's an increasing outlet for veterinary graduates. So prior to Nottingham, veterinary education in the UK, there were 6 schools, and they used very traditional teaching methods. Students would tend to have 2 years or 2 or 3 years of science teaching, preclinical science, anatomy, biochemistry, physiology, taught by biochemists, taught by physiologists. Then they would have some paraclinical training in things like radiography, ultrasound, and pathology. And finally, they would have clinical teaching. But that clinical teaching tended to take place in university hospitals, which tended to be taking referral cases from first opinion practitioners. So the caseload to which the students were exposed was not a caseload that they're going to deal with when they graduate. And the other thing is that all the veterinary schools in the UK have a pretty good research track record, but the students weren't really exposed to significant amounts of research during their undergraduate training. And the 6 schools in the UK have an international reputation. There's no doubt that veterinary education in the UK is world class. But it was very, very, very traditional, and some of the schools have been around for 200 years, and changing their teaching methods has proved, and it is proving, to be very, very difficult for them. The advantage that we had was we had a blank sheet of paper and a lot of very enthusiastic people, both within the medical school here and at GEM, and in the other schools, particularly the bioscience school on the campus at Sutton Bonington, who were very keen to try and take advantage of that blank sheet of paper and do something quite different. So we came up with an outline of a curriculum that actually exposed the students to a lot more clinical material and clinical skill development early on in the curriculum. Typically, this clinical work and the practical skills would have been delivered late in year 3, probably mostly in year 4 and year 5. So we moved a lot of the clinical teaching and a lot of the skills teaching to much earlier in the course. They still get a lot of clinical science, basic science in the first 2 years, and we carry that on into the third and fourth year. But what we tried to do was make the course very clinically oriented. And we put a significant chunk of research, which the students carry out in year 3, and we stole that unashamedly from the medical school. The medical school thought it was a good idea, had great success with it, so we just stole that idea. Like we've stolen a lot of things from the medical school. So why was there a need for a new school? Well, as I've said, we underproduce veterinary graduates in this country, and this was really brought home by the foot and mouth outbreak early in the 2000s. While the government had no difficulty recruiting vets to deal with the outbreak, the majority of the vets they recruited were from overseas, and they didn't understand UK agriculture. They came in, coldly did a job, and went away again. And it was very, very difficult to recruit UK graduates to help deal with that outbreak. And Nottingham, I believe, had been trying to open a veterinary school for many, many years. And given the difficulties the government had with the foot and mouth disease outbreak, they saw that as an opportunity and reapplied for places to open a vet school and were successful. And as I've said, even the Royal College of Veterinary Surgeons manpower survey from about 2004 said that the UK would require more vets than it is currently producing in the next 10 years. So there was a need for more vets to be produced in the UK. And there was also an increasing need for the vets, for the graduates to be trained in a slightly different way. What we need were graduates who have true day one competencies and an ability to problem solve. We have exactly the same problem as you have in medicine. There's just too much stuff out there. You cannot teach the students all the stuff they need to know. They need to have problem solving abilities. They need to be able to approach cases in a different way and understand their role in society. So we had an opportunity to do this, and also widen participation. Veterinary undergraduates tended to come from the better schools. They had 3 A's, they had 15 AS levels, and we were given a mandate by the university to recruit from areas that traditionally have much greater difficulty getting into vet school. So about 33% of our undergraduates come from a non-traditional background. Some of them, in the first 2 or 3 cohorts, don't even have A levels. They've come through other routes. And why did the university want a vet school? Well, it is an innovative, forward-looking university. It developed the graduate entry school in Derby. We learnt very early on. We had a lot of help from the guys in the graduate entry school as well as the medical school here. And we learnt very, very early on not to call it the Derby Medical School. We got into a lot of trouble. It's the University of Nottingham Medical School at Derby. So it is an innovative university. It had significant research strength in related areas, agricultural, biological, food and medical sciences. It was probably the only major professional course that the university didn't offer. And the university was keen to increase student numbers. And the other thing was that the Sutton Bonington campus had facilities which were ideal for a university already. There was already the existing bioscience school there. That had an excellent reputation for both teaching and research, and very appropriate facilities for a veterinary school. There's a commercial farm, there was a pig unit, there's an abattoir on site. As I've said, the school itself had an excellent reputation for both research and teaching. And there's a very large state-of-the-art dairy on site. For many years I used to use this slide until somebody pointed out I was talking about the fact that the School of Biosciences had a very large dairy. I've managed to fix that now. So there were a lot of reasons why the university wanted to have a vet school and put a vet school out in Sutton Bonington. Also at Sutton Bonington there was a very large field which was appropriate, and all Mr. Jagger had to do was evict a few sheep. So there was an appropriate site for the school, and this is the vet school on the day I arrived as an employee of the university. And this is the vet school now. So that field I've just shown you is here. So this is the main vet school building. This is the clinical building, and this is the menage at the back, and this is the new student accommodation that the university built. We've now also got facilities at the back of the site here where we have a small holding where we have our teaching animals, and unfortunately for the teaching animals it is very close to the abattoir, but I don't think they realise that when they're in there. So there's been a significant investment in the site in terms of delivering the school. And there was, when the university said it was going to produce a vet school, a lot of people thought, well, they'll just put the students through some courses they're already running, and they'll maybe stick them out in some practices to teach them some clinical work. But when people come along and actually see what the university has delivered in terms of infrastructure and facilities, people are generally very, very impressed. And our objective was to produce excellent clinical veterinary scientists. And the group that was put together by the university to start the process of developing the school, which Peter Rubin was very heavily involved with, they had some really high-level objectives that they wanted us to try and achieve. They were very keen that we had clinical integration and practical hands-on animal experience from day one. In some of the other schools, you can get to year 3 before you've actually handled an animal. You don't do any animal handling until you get to year 3. So we were very keen to have animal experience and clinical integration from day one, capitalise on more modern teaching methods. As I said, we spent a lot of time talking to the medical school here and at GEM, developing the teaching methods that we were going to use. Very keen to have an integrated research degree and use of relevant clinical material for the clinical teaching, not second or third opinion teaching material, but teaching the students around the cases they're going to see when they get into practice. So we began with the end in mind, really. We looked at the skills, behaviours and knowledge that they would require on day one of graduation. Now, to some extent, rather like the General Medical Council, the Royal College of Veterinary Surgeons dictates what graduates should be able to do. So we had to deliver what the Royal College wanted. And we worked back to year 4 and then back to years 1 and 2. And what that meant was that the basic science teaching that took place in years 1 and 2 was determined by clinical need. We didn't have a ruminant physiologist telling us how much ruminant physiology a student should know. We had clinicians saying, in order to understand these diseases, this is how much ruminant physiology the students need to know. Please, can you deliver it? So the basic science teaching in the first 2 years is dictated by the clinical need. And we have day one competencies which the Royal College have developed, rather like the medics have the tomorrow's doctors type guidelines. So the 3 main areas are general professional competencies and attributes, underpinning knowledge and understanding, and practical-based competencies. And we have to try and deliver these, and they are very, very high level. So examples of these are work effectively as a member of a multidisciplinary team. So we have to make sure our graduates can do that. They're as broad as this. The students have to understand the etiology, pathogenesis, clinical science, diagnosis and treatment of the common diseases and disorders that occur in the common domestic species in the UK. That's quite a lot. We have to make decisions about what are the common diseases and disorders and what are the common domestic species. As Liz has said, when we went to vet school, we were taught a lot about pigs. I suspect almost none of our graduates this year will go into pig or poultry practice, but all of them will see rabbits now. In some small animal practices, about 10% of the cases that they see are rabbits or other exotic species like bearded dragons and tarantulas and things like that people keep. So we have to develop a curriculum that satisfies this particular objective. They have to use radiographic ultrasound and other technical equipment. It's quite sobering to think that patients in Addis Ababa can't get an MRI. 2 of the practices in which our students are trained have MRI facilities for small animals and horses. And so we have to make sure that our graduates over the next 10 years will use MRI. So they have to be able to interpret MRI images. So this is the process we went through. Some things were dictated to us. That dictated what the clinical rotations looked like, that dictated what was taught in the clinical modules, and that in turn dictated what was taught in the clinical science modules. And we had to buy a lot of stuff. People kept saying, how many microscopes do you want? How many Bunsen burners do you want? We had no idea. But we did think buying a plastic horse was a good idea, because it's quite useful for teaching some of the students in the first couple of years. And this is, it was really, this is the week we moved into the building. This is a month before the students arrived. This is a microbiologist and a farm animal vet carrying stuff into the vet school. And so we thought it was a good idea to buy a plastic horse, but we got a phone call one day from the security guy at the front of the campus. He said, someone's left a parcel out the front of the building. We think it might be for you. And that's how that horse arrived. I'm not sure what we were expecting. I think we thought it would come in bits, but that's how it arrived. And they just left it there. There was no delivery note or anything. And this is, just to give you a flavour of the university's investment, this is the dissection room. It can take a whole year of 100 students, a lot of IT in there. Unfortunately, you know, as soon as you get students in there, it becomes all cluttered and gets untidy, and it looks much worse. But unfortunately, we do have to put them in there. But, so there's been significant investment. So that's some of the stuff that we did early on in terms of the curriculum development and the building and development of the school. So Liz is just going to tell you a little bit about the admissions process.
So I'm going to pick up on a few areas that we do quite differently at Nottingham, one of which is our admissions process that I know a few of you are interested in tonight. It is quite different. We decided we wanted it different because we wanted a different type of student, as Malcolm's already spoken about. So, of course, all the students apply through UCAS, and again, unashamedly stolen from the medical school. They fill in an online questionnaire separate to the UCAS system as well, where they talk about, you know, examples of where they've been very dexterous or use their communication skills and things like that. We're very proud to say that at the moment about 85% of people who apply to vet school include Nottingham on their list. So we do have a very high number of students, about 1,800 students applying each year for 100 places, so it's pretty tough to get in, but we are very popular these days, which is nice. So once they get through the UCAS process, and we take about 300 for interview, 350 for interview every year, they actually come to a whole selection sort of day, if you like. So they come to Sutton Bonington, and there we put them through a series of things, and things happen to them. So one of them is quite a traditional interview, except that, as Caroline's already mentioned, as well as two interviewees, you also have a dog or a cat in the room, which you might think is a little bit strange, but we decided this was a good idea because we just wanted to see how applicants would react to an animal being in the room. And actually, it's proved extremely useful. We have had students come in and asking if we would kindly remove the cat from their chair, which we think, well, you know, maybe not. We've also had students down on their hands and knees, literally kissing, hugging, loving the dog, and we probably don't want them quite as over-enthusiastic as that either. So it is actually quite a good thing. It's also, I think, extremely calming for, you know, an interviewee to have a dog, if they're, obviously you hope they're fairly animal-oriented, to, you know, stroke and give them a bit of attention, and that sort of takes their mind off the very nervous interview. So that's part of the process that they go through. They also have a group working assessment, so we actually put them, because we're going to be teaching them in small groups a lot of the time when they're with us in first, second and all the way through the years. We put them in a small group and give them a series of tasks to prioritise, and we just look for outliers, really. So we look for the students that, you know, are being disruptive or difficult and not joining in with the team task. The third element they do is a practical assessment, so we actually put them through sort of like little mini OSCE stations. One of the things always involves something dead, so again, are you okay to pick up something dead, because you're going to be spending quite a lot of time doing that when you're with us on the course, so that's an important screening process. But it's not about knowledge, it's just about their attitude towards getting on and doing something that they may not be particularly familiar with, and, you know, just showing us that they're all round sensible people, and solving a few problems along the way as well. And then they go into the decision process. As Malcolm's already mentioned, we do have a high widening participation percentage of students. We're also quite proud that our percentage of male students is slightly higher than the rest of the other vet schools in the UK. We're not sure if this is because more boys want to come to us because it's a more practically oriented course, or what the reason is, but we do have more boys as well, slightly more, about 25%, yeah, percent, which is high. So some years at Cambridge are 100% girls. So we're doing all right there. The second thing I wanted to highlight as being a little bit different once you get in and you're being taught in the school is around the clinical relevance process. So as we've already spoken about, our curriculum is very clinically oriented, and we do use a lot of sort of clinically focused material very early on, and this really helps to keep the students' interests and to make it a bit more like real life. So one of the things they do is they work in small groups around clinically relevant case material. They problem solve, they work through a case, which is sort of a hybrid of problem-based learning. It's not pure proper PBL, but a lot of the ideas were obviously stolen from GEM. So it's that kind of a process, but a little bit different. There is a facilitator there, and early on in the course, when they're 18-year-olds sat in a room, they are very much guided through different tasks. As they move through the years and they grow up and learn to work as groups, we release the reins a little bit and allow them to work a bit more on their own. But we hope this helps them to learn some of those skills that they're going to need as veterinary surgeons, so some decision-making and working in groups and teams, and obviously their communication skills as well. It also helps us to pick up on the perhaps slightly weaker students and offer them a bit more attention. So the video clip, this is an example of a case that we use very early on. So this is in the first module that the students go through. We're talking about bone structure and bone anatomy, and you can see this horse at the back here in the red and yellow colours actually suffers a fracture of the base of its scapula here. So we've actually got this specimen in the school. So the students watch this video, they talk about what they think has happened here. It's a stress fracture. Then we talk about the microanatomy of bones and why that happens to racehorses, because they're particularly inclined to develop stress fractures. And then at the end we show them the actual specimen. So it's sort of real life stuff. You know, this is why you need to know this really boring anatomy, and it puts it all nicely into context for them. This would be another example of the way we introduce clinically relevant material into our course. So this is an ultrasound of a horse's heart, in fact. You can tell that because it's incredibly slow. And what we do when we teach them anatomy is we use a lot of ultrasound scanning. So the students, right from day one, week one, are learning how to set up and use scanners, and then they are learning the anatomy of the dog, for example, the anatomy of dog's heart, by scanning the heart and having a look at it ultrasonographically, as well as, of course, looking at specimens and learning to clinically examine the heart as well. So it's just a good way of putting everything into context, because after all, when you're out there in practice, this is how you're going to be viewing this anatomy. So it makes absolute sense to teach them anatomy and physiology in a clinically oriented fashion. One of the other aspects of the course that I'm heavily involved in is our personal and professional skills module. So just like being a doctor, being a vet, there's more to it than just all that great knowledge and practical skills that you may have. Of course, we deal with animals, but animals always come into the consulting room or on the farm with a client or a farmer attached to them. Somebody is involved with that, and so there's obviously a lot of skills the students need to develop over the 5 years. So this is a course that runs throughout the 5 years of their training, and within this they learn lots and lots of different aspects of professionalism. So obviously communication skills is heavily emphasised. I'm going to talk about that in a second, but there's all sorts of other things. So we develop their research skills through this module. We do a lot of sort of time stress management. The profession unfortunately suffers from a very high suicide rate, so we talk to them about that, and they do lots of small group work around that, and other aspects like, you know, their general professionalism, reflective practice, lots of veterinary ethics, because it's a very ethically challenging profession at times, and some business and management skills as well that again I'm going to talk about a little bit more in a second. So just like I know doctors are trained, we use the same medical simulators as you guys use. They love coming to the vet school. It's like a special day out for them because they get to be an owner. They particularly like the farming roles because they're very challenging to learn. And our students learn exactly the same consultation methods as doctors learn. So we adapted the Calgary-Cambridge guide some years ago, and it didn't require that much adaptation because it's very straightforward. The students over the 5-year period will learn, starting with basic history taking. In fact, that previous photograph shows you their session in first year, where they just literally learn the difference between open and closed questions by sitting and chatting to owners about their animals. And then as we move through, they learn more about breaking bad news, about giving information, and about handling bereaved clients and that kind of thing. So I'm just going to show you literally a minute of this. This is one of our students. I'm not sure, the sound is not brilliant.
Yeah, that's right, yeah. I'm struggling to hear it, like, you know, and you should have what we know from the previous.
They haven't come through yet, right? So I'll just ask you.
Oh, it's terrible, it's terrible, isn't it, really? I told them, you know, a few weeks ago now, they're on the move, said we'll send all these items to you. It's all professional, so it could be critical to life and death, that kind of thing.
Well, we'll chase them up, but for the moment,
Well, I'm sure it's not, you know, I'm not telling off. No, but it's not good enough, is it? You know what I mean?
well, we'll just check for a second.
Well, you know, you're paying the money out of this, or, you know, veterinary services, you expect them to, you know, at least look after their animals. Anyway, I'll that's on myself. You'll check it.
Okay. So this is Solomon, isn't it?
Yeah, that's right, yeah.
So how is he on this one?
Well, yeah, not too bad. It's, you know, this Meta campus, I'm not saying metformin, that's what I'm saying, this Meta campus he's on, yeah, seems to be doing it, because that's sort of like just 4 years. And,
Okay, I'll stop it there. So I'll leave you on a knife edge. Just like your patients that come through the door, our clients are challenging in many different ways. I think Ron particularly relishes that role because he plays this as a bit of a market trader. He's great. It's very amusing. But that's actually our student working in the mock simulation practice they have over at Brackenhurst as part of Nottingham Trent. We take them over there for a day on their rotations, and they do some interprofessional learning with the trainee veterinary nurses, which is really good. So yeah, we take the simulators over there, and they actually run the practice as it was, which is a really good experience for them, particularly answering the telephone, which they're all really quite poor at and need a lot of practice at. This is the other aspect that I know Caroline was very interested in us doing. As we mentioned at the beginning, a lot of vets will be involved in some way in running a small business, and really this is not something that's appeared on many veterinary curricula up till now, and we were very keen that actually they did have some training. They're not going to go out day one and run their own business, we hope, but you know, they need to have an understanding of why their first boss might say, well, actually, you know, you can't have that brand new ultrasound scanner because of, you know, the general economic climate and that kind of thing. They needed to understand the way practices are managed and run, and they need to understand the changing sort of face of our industry, and as we mentioned at the beginning, you know, the fact that lots of corporate ownership is now in existence. It's very important for them to have a general background in those sort of areas. So we do in fourth year do quite a lot of business and management teaching, which covers all these sort of aspects, and in fact this culminates in their business game, which is where they work in small teams of students. They have a mentor who comes out of a practice for the day, and they have to look at a struggling practice and decide how they're going to get this practice back on track, decide which way they're going to go with it, whether they're going to get rid of the large animal work and that kind of thing. And then they have to present their ideas to our dragon's den. So you can see our very scary looking dragons in the bottom there. And they have to just basically pitch for some investment and try and get the dragons to invest in their practice. So lots of fun, but actually there's quite a serious learning message behind it as well. And they take this very seriously. They really get into it, which is great to see. Okay,
so as I said, we were very keen that the students were exposed to doing their own research projects, so they have a 12-week period at the beginning of their third year, at the end of the year before Christmas, where they only do a research project. So that's the only work that they do at the beginning of the third year. So every student does a research project which they have to complete and submit by Christmas. And as I say, this is unashamedly stolen from the medical school and works really well. The last significant difference from other vet schools is, and the thing that made the Royal College of Veterinary Surgeons very, very twitchy indeed, was the way we train the students, the way we provide the clinical training for the students. What we did was we went out and identified practices who had and enthusiasm for training students, and an appropriate clinical caseload around which to train those students. We made sure they had appropriate facilities. Where necessary, the university has invested in the facilities, built buildings, bought equipment to make sure the facilities are appropriate for clinical training, and we employ and place university staff in those facilities to train the students. But also, the staff within the practice are trained by us as educators, and many of the vets and the nurses and the other ancillary staff within the practice are very keen to be involved as educators. So we develop the facilities, employ staff, place staff, and train the clinical associate staff, and then we place the students in that environment, and they learn in generally a first opinion practice environment. And we have a number of clinical associates which provide the full range of training that the students need in pathology, in small animal practice, equine practice, farm animal practice, herd health, as Liz has said. We have a relationship with Twycross Zoo, so they probably do more exotics training than most students from most vet schools get. So we have a number of different clinical associates, and this has worked really, really well. There's a student in the charity clinic in Nottingham, not far from here, the PDSA, working with one of our members of staff. As you can see, anaesthetising a cat is actually quite a stressful procedure if you've not done it before, but Richard has probably done several thousand, so he is teaching our students in a third party's facilities, but these students will also be taught by the staff in that practice. Here's a student inducing anaesthesia, being helped by one of the nurses in one of the other practices. She's been trained as an educator and can assess the ability of this student to carry out that procedure. There's students looking at a lame horse at the Defence Animal Centre at Melton Mowbray with one of the Defence Animal Centre vets. So they're placed in facilities which have an appropriate caseload with appropriately trained staff. And the school has been reasonably successful in developing its research outputs as well. We returned in the last RAE with the School of Biosciences, and the combined submission produced the best output of any of the other vet schools compared to any of the other vet schools in the UK. But we do try and use this clinical material to inform the type of research that the school does. So the problems in general clinical practice are identified within the practices. Multidisciplinary research teams of clinicians and basic scientists within the school have a number of research activities which we hope will produce deliverables which will improve and inform clinical practice within the veterinary field. And this is helped very much by significant investment from Novartis, which has allowed us to develop a Centre for Evidence-Based Veterinary Medicine. And they're very much involved in identifying these problems at the moment, and hopefully that will inform the research outputs of the school. So that's a very brief overview of where we've been. These guys arrived 5 years ago. They get their results of their final exams tomorrow, and they graduate in July. Well, some of them, most of them, some of them will graduate in July. We like to call them pioneers. They are very, very aware that they were guinea pigs, and that's what they call themselves. But so far, the Royal College has been very pleased with what's gone on, and it really wouldn't have happened without the support of the medical schools and particularly the university. The university has been hugely supportive and permissive in the way they've allowed us to develop what we've developed. So that's all we have, unless anybody has any questions. Thank you very much.